You are listening to the Rewrite the Rules podcast. We are your hosts. My name is Beth.
I'm Natalie.
And I'm Harriet.
Rewrite the Rules podcast releases a new episode every Monday, and we're all about helping you achieve a happier and healthier relationship with food and your body.
We're real people with real life experiences, so you can expect us to be keeping it raw and real in each and every episode.
Don't forget to follow and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you use, and share the love with a friend that you think will love this podcast.
Now, let's get on to the episode.
Hello guys, welcome back to the Rewrite the Rules podcast. We hope you are all really well. This week, myself and Harriet are bringing you a very special guest. And I've said this before, we are both sort of sat here fangirling a little bit. But please welcome everyone's favourite registered dietitian, Kate Hilton. But some of you will also know her and probably better know her as Diets Debunked. Welcome, Kate, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We really, really appreciate it, and we are so frigging excited.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to kind of talk to you guys because I've been listening to your podcast for a while. So I'm very excited to actually start and be a guest on the podcast.
Yeah, we're so grateful that you're here, and we have so much we want to talk to you about. But I don't know if you're okay with starting off by just sharing, why did you decide to become a dietitian and what led you to creating Diets Debunked?
Oh God, where do I start? I decided I wanted to be a dietitian when I was probably in college, so sixth form. Originally, I wanted to actually be a doctor. I knew I wanted to work in healthcare, but I actually realised that I didn't like the kind of like procedure side of things, and I definitely wanted to go more into the nutrition side of things. You know, become a nutrition doctor. I didn't realize that a dietitian was actually a thing. That's the thing when I was at college, until I got an email through about an open day at my local hospital. And basically I went there and spoke to the dietitians there, and I just fell in love with the subject. It kind of combined everything that I wanted to do in terms of healthcare, but also with my passion and interest for nutrition. And so that combined with the fact that one of my teachers he studied to be a dietitian before he became a biology teacher, that really encouraged me to be a dietitian. Basically, throughout uni, I always knew that I wanted to do something to do with social media. Before I went into dietetics, I was one of those people who watched a lot of social media influencers, nutrition influencers, without perhaps me knowing better at the time that these people didn't know what they were talking about. But I knew as I was going through my degree that I wanted to combat that noise and combat the misinformation that was out there that was being spread by these people who hadn't actually had any formal qualifications or formal education. And so once I graduated and I had worked in the NHS for a few years, I set up Diets Debunked essentially to try and eliminate and kind of mitigate any of the misinformation and the noise that was in the nutrition space that wasn't necessarily accurate.
Yeah, because you go on your TikTok and every video is just so well informed and so well explained, and really interesting as well. I think you just have a real skill at educating people and making it interesting as well. And do you think like that's something that just like came natural to you? Do you feel like you were always pretty good at doing that?
Thank you so much. That really means a lot. I think I've always been one of those people who likes education and educating people. You know, at one point I was toying with the idea of becoming a lecturer myself. And I was always that person at uni who would take the presentations and all that kind of thing and do the education sessions. So I think that side kind of did come quite naturally to me. I really just enjoy that kind of interaction and that being able to inform people about things that they potentially don't necessarily know or aren't aware of, especially with more obscure things to do with nutrition that potentially there is a lot of misinformation on.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the kind of obscure things that we definitely want to talk to you about today is the concept of like balanced eating. Like, what is that? How does one eat in a balanced way? Because I know a lot of people, I work with a lot of people who are like, I just want to find balance with eating, but what is that and how do I do that? So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think balancing is a very individual term, and what is balanced for one person may not be balanced for another, especially depending on their relationship with food, as well as their social situation, their financial situation, their cultural situation, whatever it may be. As a general rule, I tend to look at balance as being the overall diet, not necessarily individual foods or individual meals. Because I feel like if you're looking at those individual things, you're really not seeing the bigger picture. Essentially, the healthiness of a diet, the benefit of a diet that you're going to see is going to be because of that overall dietary pattern and not because of the individual foods that you're eating in isolation. Because of that, I tend to have a very relaxed approach to balancing meals. I tend to say, if you are going to have a meal or a snack, aim to have a portion of protein, whether that be meat, eggs, dairy, or vegetarian sources like beans, pulses, lentils, tofu, tempeh, that kind of thing. Adding some vegetables, fruit, or salad to that. The amount of those, again, depends on your goals, depends on your relationship with food, depends on you yourself. As a general rule, I would say about a third of the plate is a good idea. If you're not looking to, lose weight, or if you are looking to just generally have a more balanced approach to food. Then a quarter of that plate should be a carbohydrate source of some sort, whether that be bread, potatoes, pasta, rice. Essentially, again, that is very fluid and very dependent on you, your goals, and your history with food. I would always say we should never, ever restrict or severely restrict the amounts of foods or the types of foods that we are eating. Everything should be on the table. As long as you're not allergic to it and as long as you like it, you should be able to incorporate that into your meals. It's just how you're eating it within that dietary pattern that can make the big difference.
Yeah, 100%. Because you hear, and I would love your opinion on this, because you hear a lot of people say like the 80-20, that's how you find balance. And I guess I'll just ask you, what are your thoughts on that?
As a general rule, it can be quite useful if you've got absolutely no idea where to start and you are coming from a point of, 100% of the time you're eating really, really healthy, or, like 100% of the time you're eating really, really unhealthy. Going to that 80-20 rule can be a really good place to start. But again, it is so individual. And this is exactly why I say to a lot of people that it is a good idea to work with someone who is either a nutrition professional or a therapist, especially to do with things like binge eating, because following those strict rules can worsen any previous bad habits. So it's really individual to the person and individual to the situation that you're in.
Yeah, 100%. And I loved how you said, like, if, as long as you're not allergic to it and you like it, it should never be off the table. And I think that's something that when it comes to certain foods, people, if you have a negative relationship with food, that's something that people really struggle to grasp. It's almost like as soon as they have that food, that's it. They feel like they've ruined their diet.
Yeah. And do you know what? That all or nothing mentality really feeds in and perpetuates to a poor relationship with food. I know so many people who they refuse to have, let's say, chocolate in the house because they feel as soon as they have one square, they're going to then have the whole bar, and then they're just going to think, oh, well, screw it, it doesn't matter. I'm now going to continue like with eating all of these really, really unhealthy foods. It's really how you approach that situation when that kind of thing does happen and how you deal with it that is the important thing there. And I never think that it's a good idea for someone to completely restrict a certain food, especially if it's something that they really enjoy, because ultimately food isn't just for nutrition, it's also for enjoyment. Do you see what I mean? It's something that we should be able to enjoy, and it's something that we should be able to feel like we have peace and power over, essentially.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things to talk about, the fact that there's so many reasons why we eat. Yes, of course we eat for fuel, but we also, we eat for enjoyment. We eat to celebrate with other people. Like, we eat for cultural reasons. There's so many reasons why we make decisions about our food. And I think when we just distill it to, well, I can only eat healthy foods, you're never going to have that balance. And I think something that Kate, like I've heard you say a few times, it's like, you can have the healthiest diet in the world, but if your relationship with food isn't healthy, then you're not having a healthy diet. And it's
That is one of my favorite sayings. Is at the end of the day, you could have a diet that is purely fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, whole grain carbohydrates with no added salt, sugar, saturated fat. But at the end of the day, if that diet is coming from a place of an unhealthy relationship with food, the diet isn't healthy, because you don't have that healthy psychological element to the diet. And that is something that a lot of people tend to forget when they go on to these kind of really, really restrictive or really strict diets, that you need to also have that psychological element to the food that you're eating. And that needs to be in place in order for that diet to be considered healthy.
100%. Yeah.
And as someone, like for me personally, as someone who had like fruits and vegetables like forced upon her from a young age, it actually sort of turned me against them for a little bit. So I just love your like relaxed perspective in terms of, right, let's aim for a third of your plate, but also don't shame yourself or be like hard on yourself if you can't get there right now. Because a lot of people are maybe like having to reintroduce foods like that, and having like a third of your plate of fruit and veg forced upon you can often have like a negative effect as well. So I really appreciate like your more relaxed approach to that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing that I will always say is, because it is so individual, everybody starts at a different place. And, what would be considered an improvement for me would likely be too much for someone else because of where I'm starting from. If you're having a diet that is already has no fruits and vegetables in it, even just adding in a handful of blueberries a day is a massive improvement on what you were previously doing. For me, that would not be an improvement because I'm starting at a higher place. And this is where that individuality comes in. And, we don't want to put those hard and fast, strict rules and strict limits on things, because it can set people up for failure. And it can make them feel like they're not making any improvements, when in actuality, any kind of improvement is an improvement, irrespective of how good that improvement would seem to someone else.
And this is why we always say, like, never compare your diet to anything you see on Instagram, because I used to see other people's food and think, oh my God, I am doing so badly in comparison in terms of like creating healthy meals and things like that. And that is like completely backs up that point, really.
Absolutely. And the thing is to remember as well is social media is a lie most of the time. Let's be honest. I can guarantee you that those fitness and wellness influencers, they don't eat like that 24/7. They're never going to show you the times where they potentially binge on certain foods that would be considered unhealthy, because that doesn't fit their brand. And, it would do detriment to them and to their brand. And so it can kind of set us up for really unrealistic expectations as to how we should be eating, can't it?
Absolutely. And I guess it's like, out there's so many what I eat in the days. There's so many review videos where people then like stitch like someone's what I eat in the day, and they're like, this is bad, this is good. And it's in my head, I'm just thinking, is this helpful?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know I would never stitch someone's what I eat in a day, because you don't know how that person eats 24/7. You don't know how accurate that is. And secondly, did they ask? No, they didn't. And it's also kind of the same reason why, if I do a what I eat in a day, which I have done in the past, I try and make it as relatable as possible. I show that I eat chocolate. I show that I'll have a glass of wine. I show that I'll have something that people would look at me and say, you're a dietitian, you shouldn't be eating that. Because it helps people understand that nutrition isn't black and white, clear cut. There are many shades of grey, and you can absolutely incorporate any food into a diet and it can still be a healthy diet.
I appreciate that sort of content so much as well. Like, I want to see you eating the slices of pizza. I want to see you eating out of the like not aesthetic Tupperware container. Like, I don't want perfect lighting and beautiful food, because like that's not what I'm eating most of the time as well. So I love that.
Exactly. And that other kind of content just makes people feel bad about themselves, doesn't it? Because they think, why can't I do that? But in reality, those influencers that are eating those green juices and like smoothies with 20 different supplements in them, they are living in basically a different universe to the rest of us. That is their full-time job. They don't have all of the other responsibilities. They have a lot of financial freedom, which most people don't. And that kind of stuff can really influence what they do eat. So it's really just working with what you've got. Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. But I was going to say, like, me and Beth connected originally because I just loved her. You didn't do loads of what I eat in the days, but you showed your supermarket shops. And I remember it was just so refreshing. Like, to see you, like I have a lasagna for lunch. It was like, you didn't see anyone like a few years ago, like, post that,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the big reasons why I did it, because I suffered for a very long time. And I think a lot of it was because I was comparing what I was doing, what I was eating to everyone else. And I didn't follow anyone else that ate like more than a serving of pasta and like things like that. And I was like, you know what, if I can't find it, I'm going to start creating it. And I sort of like shared my own journey to food freedom as well. And that sort of came into it, because I think for me, like, support and having people be like, actually, you're doing amazing. Like, I really appreciate this content. That sort of like spurs you on in a way. But yeah, like taking that first picture of the lasagna and being like, I'm having this for lunch was like a big thing for me as well, after like demonizing foods like that for so long. So yeah, thank you, Harriet.
Of course. But Kate, I'm interested in like your opinion. Like, I think I've definitely had a lot of clients who they initially think they need to like get the biscuits out of the house, get the chocolate out of the house, because they have this belief that you have one, that's it, like they'll have the whole pack. And if you had a client who had that kind of like struggle, what's kind of some guidance or advice would you give them?
Oh gosh, there's so much advice that I can give people who are struggling with that kind of thing. I mean, the first thing that I would suggest to them is, if they feel like they have multiple fear foods, keep at least one of them in the house at all times. And what I would want them to do is understand, and we would work together, understanding their cues of hunger, their types of hunger that they're experiencing, understanding their hunger and satiety, and understanding the reasons why they may be eating when they aren't hungry. So the first things that we would discuss would be the types of hunger, the false hunger that they experience, whether they are experiencing emotional hunger, whether that be for pleasure or because of a negative emotion, understanding whether it's an environmental hunger, whether it's because it's there, that they're seeing it, that's why they're trying to eat it, whether it be because they can smell it, whatever that experience is, whether it be that it's the situation that they're in. And understanding the difference between those types of hunger and true hunger is a really key element to this kind of thing. If you think of kind of true hunger, it comes on a bit like a wave, we don't suddenly notice it. We start off with very little hunger, we get a little bit peckish, and then we get to the point where we're like, okay, we do need to eat then. That is true hunger. Whereas those false hungers that I talked about, they do tend to hit you like a ton of bricks, and they can be really difficult to ignore. Now, if you can identify that you are experiencing one of those types of false hunger, that can make it a lot easier to compartmentalize it in your brain and kind of rationalize the kind of experiences that you then do and the way that you act. Equally, what I would always encourage is, during that period of that fear food being in their house, is identifying whenever they do eat it, number one, how much they ate, what that false hunger cue was, but then equally trying to unpick and identify whether there was a trigger there. Because more often than not, for any kind of binge eating, for any kind of uncontrollable eating, there is some form of trigger that you can pick up in that pattern. Once you can understand that trigger, we can then work to break down that trigger, and we can then work to remove that kind of feeling of uncontrollable eating around that food. And this is partly why it's really important to have that food freely available in the house, because having that food freely available in the house also not only allows that situation to happen and allows you to identify when those triggers are happening, but it also then removes the morality of that food. Because I think one of the big things with food at the moment, especially with social media, is that there seems to be this morality that is placed on certain foods. Certain foods are good, certain foods are bad. You shouldn't be eating these foods. And if you do eat those foods, you should feel bad about yourself. You should feel guilty. Removing that morality there can really, really help people reduce the likelihood of those binges, and also reduce the likelihood of them feeling really negative about themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, that was an amazing answer. I love that, honestly, because yeah, I think the guidance of just get rid of it, just don't have it in the house. What problem are you fixing? You're not problem solving at all. And it's implying that there's something wrong with that food, you shouldn't have it. And that creates the fear.
Yeah, that is exactly right. And you kind of hit the nail on the head there, in the sense that you aren't actually fixing anything if you're just removing that food. What happens if you are in a situation where that food is present? You've not fixed the underlying problem. All you've done is buried it and ignored it. You've not actually worked through the emotions, worked through the reasons why you hyperfixate on that food and why you will then start overeating that food. You are just burying it, and that is only either going to transfer to another food that is you are allowing yourself in the house, and then cause even more fear foods that leads to even more restriction, or it is just going to, as I say, you're just going to ignore it, and then when that food is present, you are then going to overeat on it, and the cycle continues.
Yeah. Or you just, in my personal experience, you just go to the shop and you buy that food.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that kind of thing happens all the time, especially if you live somewhere where going to the shop is readily accessible. You just have to walk to the shop. It is so easy for that to happen. And that, again, just perpetuates that negative feeling that you have about it. And the cycle continues, and it makes it worse. And you're not actually breaking that cycle.
Yeah. And it really strengthens, like, it intensifies, like, if you struggle with binge eating, that's something that can really intensify the binges as well, because you're like, it kind of, you push that effort button, and then you think, well, I'm doing it just this one time, making a special trip out, I might as well get as much as possible to make it worth it.
Absolutely. And then the thing is that once you've done it once, you can then justify doing it again and again and again, and the situation snowballs and escalates and gets so much worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And I love that you also said that sometimes it transfers from one food to another. If you don't have access to the one, you're going to find something else. So for my personal experience, I didn't have like access to chocolate. So I'd like binge on things like icing sugar, because that's literally what I had in the house at the time. And I've heard so many people have that exact same experience of, I don't have access to normal chocolate, so I'm going to eat the cooking chocolate, or like the chocolate buttons out of the cupboard, or like raid the baking cupboard, if you know what I mean. And a lot of people feel isolated and like a bit crazy in that behavior. So I think just that there like has validated so many people's experience.
Absolutely. And it's such a common thing to happen, especially if you grew up in quite a restrictive household. I see a lot of people, exactly as you said, they grew up in households where chocolate wasn't really allowed in the house. The only chocolate that was allowed was the bittersweet baking chocolate chips to make cookies with. And they would go and binge on those, and they thought that was really strange. But it makes sense, because that food is forbidden. It's kind of that idea that the forbidden fruit is then so tempting, and you hyperfixate on it, and you'll do anything you can to have that kind of food. So it makes complete sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's just about, working out your why behind your triggers. And I personally just love the problem solving approach, because I think it empowers you to actually be like, okay, what is the problem? Let me unpack this. Let me really understand more about myself, learn more about myself. And then you start to obviously make progress when you do that. And then that's even more empowering. And then it just helps you, it fuels you to keep going, which I think is really important, instead of just kind of getting stuck on that, in that cycle.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Having that problem solving approach can be really empowering for people, and it can make them feel like they are actually making progress. Because I know with anybody that struggles with binge eating, it does feel like you get stuck on that perpetual loop, and it doesn't matter what you do, you can't get yourself out of it. But having that ability to kind of logically and methodically think about, okay, why is it that I'm having this binge eating? Why is it that I do this? Is there a specific reason or a specific trigger? It can really just help you feel like you've got that control back, because that's the big thing with binge eating. You feel like you're just not in control. And getting that control back is such a powerful move and a powerful statement to yourself.
Yeah, I love that. Obviously, like we're going into December. When this podcast will be released, it will be December. And I think this is a time where it's, for a lot of us, it's easier to like overeat because of the different occasions and events and whatever. And I think a lot of people struggle to just give themselves permission to just allow themselves, like, hey, I may eat more this month because of the context. It's Christmas. And I think it's also just about giving yourself that initial permission that it's okay.
Absolutely. It's one of those times of years where people do really struggle, and oftentimes things like binge eating does get worse. And I think one of the biggest problems is not allowing yourself that permission to eat the foods that you want to eat. You know, the thing is when you do have that kind of restriction mentality where you say, okay, I'm only going to be eating, you know, my regular 3 meals a day. I'm not going to eat anything unhealthy except on Christmas Day. The thing is as soon as you do that, you see it around you all the time, all those foods around you, you either give in to temptation and feel really bad about yourself, or when it gets to Christmas Day, you have the biggest blowout that you've had all year and you feel guilty again. And then that leads into that all or nothing mentality where it's like, well, I've done it once, I'm going to do it again. And then it gets worse and that cycle continues. It's so common with people over the Christmas holidays. And that's the biggest thing I can say is don't restrict yourself. Don't say to yourself, I am going to be good this Christmas. I'm not going to allow myself to have a mince pie. I'm not going to allow myself to have some celebrations. Don't do that to yourself, because that is only going to set yourself up for failure.
I think, especially when we get to this time of year, a lot of people will hear what you've said, but sort of see two paths in front of them. They all either sort of enter December thinking, you know what, I'm just going to have a whole, probably what they call like cheat month. Like, we hate that word, but that is how I used to envision December. I'm going to get to the first, we're going to eat everything in sight for the next 31 days. Or I'm going to diet throughout the whole month. We're having no chocolate, no nothing. I'm not even going to have like an advent calendar or anything like that. How would you sort of navigate trying to take a middle path as opposed to all of one way or all of the other way? Like, it's a very tricky time. So I just love like your advice. 1st of December, what do we do?
I think that it kind of all comes back down to that balance that we talked about at the beginning, making sure that just in general, you are vaguely balancing your meals where you can, whatever that looks like for you. So as an example, for me, when it gets to, you know, the Christmas meals, the Christmas roasts and things like that, I'll make sure I have some turkey for my protein. I'll make sure I have some vegetables. I'll make sure I have my potatoes. And then I can let myself have the pudding afterwards, of course, because that's what I like. But just making sure in general that those meals are balanced. What I would also say is over this period, don't skip meals. Even if you had a time where you binge at some point, say you binged the day before, do not skip meals. Do not let your previous dietary patterns affect the dietary patterns and the dietary choices that you are going to make later on in that day. And that goes the other way as well. Don't let that binge then make you throw in the towel and think, oh, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to continue going down that path of just gorging myself with everything, because both of those things aren't being helpful to you and to your mental health. Both of those things are going to make you feel rubbish, because if you're restricting, you're more likely to binge later. And if you are just throwing in the towel and just binging for the sake of it, you are still going to feel negative about that.
Yeah.
It really kind of comes into that idea of compartmentalizing each of those meals that you have and take it a meal at a time. Don't kind of let those previous meals influence what you're going to eat for the next one. And again, don't try and restrict calories over this time. It's going to be impossible. Don't try and track. Don't try and weigh yourself and all that kind of thing, because ultimately over this time, it is normal for people to plateau if they're wanting to lose weight. It is normal for people to gain weight. It is normal for people to eat a bit more than they usually would, because it's a social and festive occasion. Again, this goes back to the idea that we eat for many different reasons other than just nutrition. We eat because it's social, because it's cultural, because it's something that we enjoy doing. And that's okay. You can absolutely do that. Yeah. And only thing that's going to happen from you tracking, from weighing, from any of that kind of stuff is it's going to make you feel miserable about yourself. There's no point, absolutely no point. I would also say that it's a good idea over this time to kind of get into using the hunger and satiety scale where possible, especially if you're worried that you're going to be overeating in meals. Essentially, the hunger and satiety scale gives you an idea of whereabouts you are in terms of your hunger and fullness. A lot of people think that hunger and fullness is kind of a bit of an on-off switch, but in reality, it's a bit of a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that you keep yourself within a certain range between the levels of 3 and 5-ish, occasionally going up to a level 6 or 7, which is like a little bit full, lightly full. But don't let yourself get to the extremes of really, really full or really, really hungry, because that can really encourage that binge restrict behavior. You know, you get yourself really, really full, you feel really guilty, you restrict the next day, then you get really, really hungry, you're absolutely famished, and then the cycle continues because you then eat absolutely everything that is in sight. But just in general, I think the best thing to do is have that balance where possible. And as I say, take each meal as it comes.
Yeah.
Don't let what you did with the previous meal influence your behaviors at the next meal. And equally, it doesn't even necessarily need to be a meal. The snacks, the drinks that you're having, don't let all of those things influence those choices that you are then making. Compartmentalize it, understand why it happened, accept it, and move on.
Yeah, 100%. And I know exactly what hunger fullness scale you're talking about. And I think it's so helpful for people just keep it on their phones, keep it on your phone so that you can just look at it throughout the day. And exactly what you said, try not to let yourself get either end of that spectrum. And it's just protecting you, really. I also wanted to ask you, so for example, with like a food like crisps, right? Where they're really yummy. I personally love crisps. They're really flavorful. They're cheap. They're easy. They're crunchy, but they don't fill you up. And so I think a lot of people struggle with them because you just want more. And I wonder if like foods like that, maybe another example is like biscuits or like celebrations. Would you recommend like if they are someone's like trigger foods to combine them with like other foods so that they can have them but then feel satisfied and it's just a less risky situation?
Absolutely, especially in the early stages of like improving your relationship with food. Absolutely. Okay. I would say either have them after a fully satiating meal, because that will make you less likely to overeat on them, or have them in combination with something else. So taking like the biscuits, for example, one thing that I like to say to people is to have them alongside something that contains protein or something that contains fiber, because that is going to not only fill you up, but it's going to improve the nutrition of those biscuits. It's going to make you feel like you've done something proactive to prevent a binge on those biscuits later. And ultimately, that is going to be more satisfying and make you less likely to overeat because it will make you fuller quicker. But that is a really, really good tip is, as I say, especially in the beginnings of improving your relationship with food, is to try and balance it with either another meal or just have it alongside something else, because that can really, really help.
Yeah, I really love that because it's such good practical advice, because I think a lot of people are really inspired by food freedom, which is amazing, and really inspired by wanting to face their fear foods. But, you know, let's say something like crisps or biscuits. So I think, okay, I'm going to have them. And suddenly they're really triggered and it's really hard to stop. And then they lose hope. So I think this practical advice will be so valuable.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to say as well, if you do have a situation where over the holidays you do have a binge on those foods, that's okay. And it's okay. And you should accept that it's happened, but don't let it influence the rest of your day, the rest of your week, the rest of your month. Don't let it necessarily negatively impact you, because everybody, even if they have a healthy relationship with food, does sometimes have those situations where they overeat on a certain food. That is okay. It's again, that compartmentalizing it, accepting it that it happened, and then moving on is the best and the healthiest thing that you can do in those situations.
Yeah, I love that so much, because you've just explained it perfectly, because obviously we help people who struggle with binge eating, and often, you know, people put that pressure on themselves and that expectation, okay, now I've committed to this work, I can never binge again. And if I do binge, I've failed. And something that I really try to stress is that we welcome failures, because if you've binged, this is feedback. Now we can look into why that has happened and learn from it. It's information, essentially.
Yes, exactly. And I love that what you said there is that it's not a failure. Just because you've had a binge, it does not mean that you have failed, and it doesn't mean you should throw in the towel. It means that there is still something there that we need to work on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a failure, because everybody has those things that happen. Everybody has those situations where it's so stressful that they do just want to eat a tub of ice cream or anything along those lines. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that we can take the information from that, we can work on it, and we can improve that, so to reduce the risk of it happening again later.
Yeah, and it's taking the morality away from it, which you mentioned like earlier. Like, of course, I understand that like having a binge is very distressing, and I understand obviously it's something that people want to stop. But I think sometimes people treat binges like it's like life or death. And sometimes maybe I struggle to articulate it, but if you have a binge, it's not the worst thing in the world. We can move on from it. It's okay.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It is okay. These things happen. These things absolutely do happen. And, we can learn from it. We can work on it. And from there, we can reduce the risk of it happening again.
Absolutely.
On the line of Christmas, I'd love to like quickly ask like your top tips, because I know a lot of people are going to be waking up December 1st and already triggered at the thought of an advent calendar. And even though it's a very, very tiny, minuscule piece of chocolate, a lot of people will struggle to just have that as like a peaceful part of their day. So have you just got any like top tips for anyone who may be listening to this episode and just like stressing and just wanting to be able to have that tiny bit of chocolate at breakfast time? What would you say to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely understand where that's coming from. A lot of people do find, especially because chocolate does tend to be quite a bit of a fear food for a lot of people, why they would find that really, really difficult. I think the best thing that I can say to you is that, number one, do not try and restrict your calories to fit it in to whatever it is that you're having. Eat as you normally would, because as soon as you start doing that, you're going to then see that caloric restriction. You're going to then see that you are then going to be really looking forward to that chocolate more and more each day. And it may get to a point where it's like, oh, screw it, I'll have the entire advent calendar all at once. So don't try and adapt your diet to fit that in. Just let it fit in naturally. I'd always say to, especially if it's one of your fear foods or if it's something that you feel like you are going to end up binging on, I would really suggest to have that alongside your breakfast. Whether it be you've got some porridge, you can either kind of like chop it up into little pieces, put it in the porridge. That could be a really good way of incorporating it in, or even just having it on the side. Because if you're having it alongside a balanced breakfast that contains a bit of protein, that contains some carbs, that contains some fruit or veg, that is going to reduce your risk of still being hungry and wanting more of that chocolate afterwards. I would also say if you do end up going down that path and you do end up having the whole thing, number one, try and get out of that all or nothing mentality. If it's happened, it's happened. It's okay. Doesn't necessarily need to affect the rest of your day. Doesn't mean you need to then not eat for the rest of the day because you've had all of that chocolate. Eat as you normally would. Eat when you are hungry. Eat when you need to eat, because that is going to reduce your risk of further binges down the line. Again, as I say, don't try and further restrict later, whether that be removing the chocolate, instead of having the celebrations that you were going to have later, don't then not have them because of the fact that you had extra earlier. That's okay. It's all right. And essentially just continually trying to eat mindfully where you can. The meals that you're having, making sure you're eating them slowly and methodically, eating them in a comfortable environment where you're not necessarily distracted by a load of things, because all of that can really help you make more rational decisions when it comes to food, more rational decisions when it comes to the things that you're eating, and overall reduce your risk of that turning into a binge.
Thank you so much.
Oh, this was such an amazing conversation. Like everything you've said has just been so valuable. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's been a pleasure to be on the podcast. I've really enjoyed it.
And we would love to let our listeners know, like, what services do you offer and how can they find you if they want to work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I offer a broad range of dietetic services, including helping people with their relationship with food in particular. But I can also help people to lose or gain weight if that is something that they require. I'm also specialised in IBS if you have any kind of bowel troubles, as well as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So I can help with all of those range of conditions. If you did want to find me, I'm on TikTok. I'm at Diets Debunked on TikTok as well as on Instagram. But I also have a website, which is www.dietsdebunked.co.uk. And if you would like to work with me, you can fill in the form and I'll get back to you.
I love that. And guys, if you're not on Kate's TikTok, get on there because you're missing out.
Thank you so much.
Honestly, I love it so much. Like I even like watch it and I'm like taking notes, and because I've done a few nutrition modules in the past, and I've honestly just found it so difficult and hard to understand. And I'm not just saying this, but you're the first person who I'm like, oh, I actually get this now, and this actually makes sense, and this is interesting.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you found them useful.
Of course. But no, just thank you again for being here and taking the time. We really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And we'll be back. For the listeners, we'll be back next week with another episode. So thank you for tuning in as well. And we'll see you soon. Bye, guys. Bye.